Well, we thought it'd be nice in this little interlude before our next session to have a discussion about WAF winners. And it would also be nice just to remind ourselves what the live event is like. So here a very short little glimpse of the world of WAF Live.
The World Architecture Festival is where designers and architects from around the world gather to share ideas, find inspiration, and set the future agenda.
You're meeting the whole world of architecture in one place. Live is priceless.
It's the event. It's like the who's who of architecture.
It's one place where architects come from all over the world. It opens your eyes to what's going on, what's current, and what's getting built, and what's on the drawing boards.
Watch over 500 architects pitch their work in the live crits. You can choose who to see and fit in as many as you can over 3 days.
You can travel the world just by watching each and every project from every competition. It's just mind-blowing.
I think it's a great opportunity to see lots of different projects and just see what everyone else is doing and learn from it and get inspiration.
Be inspired by world-renowned speakers talking about critical topics in architecture on the WAF stage.
As architects, we have the gift in our hands to save vast amounts more carbon.
Visit the main festival hall to discover the latest technologies and products to use on your projects.
It's really architects talking to architects. We don't have enough of those opportunities, and so this event is so unique globally and so important.
I think it's very well organized and very spacious. I'm very honored to be here.
WAF 2020 takes place in Lisbon. We look forward to seeing you there.
Well, that's what we've been missing this December when we should have been in Lisbon, as I'm sure many of you will know. But we will be back in that marvellous city live next year. And just thinking about WAF over the years, Jeremy, I was very struck by looking at our list of completed building winners. It would be very difficult to say, well, there's a typical building or a typical style or a typical sort of architect who will inevitably win WAF. It hasn't worked out like that, has it?
No, and sometimes our projects by very little known architects have won over very well-known architects. And I think that's one of the things about WAF, is that it is, we hope at least, through the robustness of its judging process, a genuinely level playing field for architects to enter and be judged fairly, whether they're known to a jury or not.
Yes, because I think the perhaps two unexpected winners. One year we had a really sweet chapel stroke tea house in Ho Chi Minh City. And this was very, very appealing to our super jury that year, which was chaired by Richard Rogers, by the Vietnamese small firm called A21. Another example would be the Chinese university in Hong Kong, who did an experimental project in Guangming, which was a rammed earth prototype house to cope with seismic conditions. And I think that the audience at the awards dinner was really delighted to see a project like that beating some fairly big blockbuster buildings that year.
And of course, what it does is reflect what the number of levels on which architecture can work to improve people's lives. I mean, that project came about after, I think there was more than one serious earthquake in China, which killed numerous people and obviously destroyed many, many more homes. And that the idea that architects could use professional skills to address that sort of problem, as well as the great sort of headline signature projects that we all know and get published everywhere, I think was very interesting. And of course, that's part of what WAF is trying to uncover. are the layers of architectural skill, wherever they are in the world and however they are applied.
And I suppose from that point of view, actually one of the few winners that we've had, which was already very well known, was Zaha Hadid's Maxi Centre in Rome. But an interesting jury that year, Catherine Gustafsson, the landscape architect, was very taken with the flows and form and rhythm of that building in its relation to the city, quite apart from its formal qualities as an art gallery.
Yes, and of course the historian and curator Barry Bergdahl, who was then the chief curator for architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, recognized its qualities as a curatorial tool as well. So that project had all sorts of qualities which perhaps would not have come out in a conventional publication article about it.
Yes, and I think actually it was a tribute to the power of the competition idea, that it's a building that had a very, very long gestation, but actually as completed, it was almost identical to the competition-winning design. And I think it's underestimated how the power of the inspirational idea, allied to a technical understanding of what will be involved, if it's powerful enough, it becomes quite difficult for anybody to fiddle with it without either completely destroying it, so why bother, or leaving it as it is, as a kind of complete proposition.
Yes, and of course it's dealing with a very long and distinguished architectural history of Rome itself. And it's not quite in the historic core of Rome, obviously, but it's very close to the great Olympic buildings of the 1960 Olympics. And it is walkable from the centre of Rome. I mean, I managed it, so I'm sure everyone else could.
I think our other big completed building winner from Italy was in our very first year, 2008, the Università Luigi Boccioni in Milan, which was a competition-winning scheme by Grafton Architects. It had a kind of brutalist flavour to it, a big concrete structure. Now, the chair of the jury that year, the super jury, was supposed to be Norman Foster, and he was indeed in Barcelona for the judging. But one of Foster and Partners' own buildings had made the finals, so he had to step down and was very ably replaced by Bob Stern, Robert Stern, Dean of Architecture at Yale at the time. And you might have thought, well, that's not the sort of architecture Bob does, but he was a huge enthusiast for it, and for Grafton, who I think weren't hugely known outside Dublin at that time. They'd won this scheme in international competition, but of course they've gone on to become very well known around the world.
Yes, and I think it's quite an interesting exercise, which other historians will have to uncover, is the extent to which their international career was launched by winning WAF in the first year.
Well, our second year was such a huge contrast. And of course, I don't say that we were nervous about this, but I think we always wondered whether people would start submitting entries and juries would be influenced by what had won previously. But we needn't have worried, because in the second year, the Mapam Gubwe Interpretation Centre in Limpopo, northern South Africa, was the winner. Raphael Vignoli was the chair of the jury. He's certainly never done a project like that. Jeremy, I think Peter Rich, architect's a worthy winner.
Absolutely, a fantastic project. Quite small. I mean, this is another example, like Robert Stern arguing as chair of the jury for the Grafton building, a building which is not what he would have designed had he been given the commission. This is not a project that Raphael Vignoli would have designed. Known for very large-scale urban architecture, obviously, huge boost to his career as winning the Tokyo Forum project 30 years ago. But a incredibly sensitive and subtle reflection on the culture of that territory of Southern Africa between South Africa and Zimbabwe. Very, very rich history of which there is very little physical trace. And what Peter Rich and his team did was to give some sort of architectural form that allowed that history, those cultural traditions to be uncovered and appreciated.
And in fact, that project also involved kind of reinventing or rediscovering a construction history in that area, which had been entirely lost, and some academic research produced evidence of sort of catenary vaulting in an equivalent of brick. And what was marvelous as a human story about that win was the way a local workforce had been reintroduced actually to building techniques of their ancestors, and produced a rather wonderful kind of landscape suiting complex as a consequence. Well, I suppose as the final winner, when after 4 years in Barcelona, was a very different kettle of fish, because the Catalan architect Enric Ruiz Gelli and his practice Cloud9 won the Building of the Year with a media complex heavily geared towards Barcelona's climate, creating column-free space and using gas-filled pads on the exterior, producing rather extraordinary-looking building, which seemed to work rather well. We held a reception there, I remember.
Yes, and very interesting, because that was a building which perhaps could only have come out of the extraordinary renaissance of architecture and urbanism that came out of Barcelona from the sort of, I would say, the mid-1980s. Marta Verbihiges Mackay obviously deserve a big credit there, as do various people who worked in the city authorities, planners and architects. This was really the sort of culmination of that, a work of enormous imagination, which gave a very different sort of workplace, I think, to the conventional.
Yes, and this was part of an attempt, well, I think a successful attempt, to establish a particular district in Barcelona for new tech industries and startups. Well, we moved to Singapore in 2012, and by coincidence, because, you know, another year the project would have been too old, another year it might have been too young, but it was finished and it was judgeable. And our big winner in 2012 was the Gardens by the Bay project in Singapore, produced by a team of designers, and the super jury led by Neil Denari was very insistent that we award the prize to the whole team, not just the architects, but the architects, of course, coordinated everything, and they were Wilkinson Eyre, and a pretty amazing project right next to our festival venue, Moshi Safdie's Marina Bay Sands complex.
Yes, I think we should, out of fairness and respect for Neil Denari, name the rest of the team, who were the landscape architect, Andrew Grant and his firm, and then Ateliers 1 and 10, respectively, structural engineers and M&E engineers, particularly because the brief required this would be giant greenhouses, more or less on the equator, with a cooler atmosphere inside and outside. And of course, the great greenhouses of the 19th century, one thinks of the Palm House at Kew being a great example, were to bring a bit of a tropical or a warmer climate to a colder climate. What had to be done in Singapore was to bring colder climates to the tropics. I mean, a very interesting reversal of what that typology was originally devised to do.
Then the following year, we flipped further around the world, going east and south. A wonderful project by FJMT, Richard Francis Jones, the Auckland Art Gallery. Super jury, very impressed with the kind of cultural contextual response. It was chaired by Ken Ushima that year.
I think an extremely interesting reflection of some of the things that have become quite current in the last few years, and were certainly discussed then, but perhaps not with quite the same urgency, which is, how do you deal with what are in effect building types that come out of Western traditions, the museum, the gallery, but for a context which is not Western? And how do you reflect indigenous culture or other forms of non-Western culture, particularly where it started, as in New Zealand? And I think that was a great example of how, the global practice of architecture, when sensitively and intelligently applied, really can engage in that way. And we've had other projects from New Zealand that have addressed similar issues.
Indeed. Well, we've mentioned already the chapel in Ho Chi Minh City. In 2015, Peter Cook was the jury chair, and we gave the big prize to Interlace, this extraordinary stacked housing by Ola Sheeran, which he referenced yesterday in his presentation. And this was the concept of taking a series of what would normally just have been 12 tower blocks, stacking them horizontally and thereby creating lots of landscape space. I mean, actually more than was occupied by the development itself, lots of shading, rather good living conditions, and not high-end prices either.
Another project which the significance of which is greater than its own, as it were, terms of reference, as you say, in providing a model for medium-priced housing, quite high density, but very attractive place to live. I remember walking around it one evening in Singapore and thinking this would be a wonderful place to live.
Well, David Chipperfield chaired the 2016 Super Jury, and the big award went to the National Museum in Szczecin, Poland, and it was by Robert Konieczny. And slightly unusually, I think, for David, because he said, well, that this building had a number of features that normally he disliked. For example, a curving roof, space put below ground, but actually it was a very sophisticated piece of thinking.
Yes, and I have to say another example of the intelligent thinking of our super jurors, where they can recognise quality that they wouldn't have themselves conceived.
Now, we've mentioned the seismic zone China prototype house, James Timberlake with the super jury chair that year. 2018, WOHA, frequent category winners in Singapore, and they've won the big prize, super jury chair by Natalie de Vries for the Kampung Admiralty project. And like many of their projects, a wonderful combination of thinking about the social composition inside the building and the relationship between built form and landscape.
And how senior citizens can have a decent life, well served by medical facilities, by community action.
And so to 2019, as mentioned at the start of today's session, in the studio behind us, our backdrop is an image of the Lokaal project in Tilburg, Netherlands by Civic Architecture. Meccano were involved with the interiors. And the super jury had no hesitation in picking this as a winner. It was chaired by Murat Tabaliolu. And one of the reasons we liked it was the way that it was taking redundant industrial space, not just in this building, but the whole area around it, and transforming it in a way one could think of as really as a piece of city retrofit, not just building retrofit.
Absolutely. And I think, again, a project that transcends its own limits, its own terms of reference, because there are lots of vast industrial buildings that can be converted, as we see behind us, into very congenial public space, which was not what they were conceived for.
And actually, this building also combines other interests of ours, the landscape elements inside it, the nature of the interior design, a very complete piece of synthetic architectural thinking. Well, I hope that's been of some interest to go through our big winners from yesteryear. We're now coming back to the here and now and the consequences of COVID and the pandemics. And I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Melvin to introduce the next session, which will be on the subject of the post-COVID workplace.